The mansion felt colder than usual, though the afternoon sun poured through its tall windows. The family had gathered here countless times before, birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, but never like this. Just 3 days earlier, the patriarch of the family, the grandfather, had been laid to rest. Now they sat in the heavy silence he left behind, waiting to hear how his life's work would be divided. At the head of the polished wooden table sat Robert, the grandfather's eldest son, now the one expected to hold the family together. His broad shoulders were squared, but the weight pressing down on him was visible in the dark circles beneath his eyes. Beside him sat his wife, poised yet tense, her hands folded too tightly in her lap. Next to her, their son shifted uncomfortably, the only grandchild in the room, old enough to sense what was at stake but young enough to still feel powerless in it. On the far end of the table, the lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. His briefcase sat open, papers neatly stacked, his tone measured as he began. Your father wished for his will to be read with everyone present. He believed in facing things head-on. His voice echoed softly in the room. In the corner, almost invisible, stood Mrs. Harris, the housekeeper. She had worked for the family for over 20 years, long enough to know their patterns, their tempers, their silences. She kept her head slightly bowed, her apron smoothed neatly, but her eyes missed nothing. The lawyer's words filled the space, dry phrases about estates and trusts, about land and property. Still, no one truly listened. Each person was waiting for the part that mattered to them. Every breath, every glance carried tension, as though the air itself had grown too heavy. And then it happened. A buzz cut through the room, sharp, jarring, impossible to ignore. Heads turned. On the table, Robert's phone lit up, vibrating once, then again. He reached for it slowly, trying to keep his expression steady. But when his eyes fell on the glowing screen, the mask slipped. His face paled, his lips pressed tight, and his hand froze mid-air. Across the table, his wife noticed. Her own breath caught, her eyes narrowing as she leaned ever so slightly forward. The son looked from one parent to the other, sensing something was wrong. The lawyer hesitated, his voice trailing off, papers forgotten in his lap. On the phone, in plain black letters, a message waited. The DNA results are in. The room seemed to shrink around them. Robert didn't move. He didn't speak. The phone buzzed once more, the sound echoing louder than the lawyer's voice, louder than the silence itself. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood whatever was inside that phone might matter more than the will of the dead man himself. Robert's thumb hovered just above the screen, as if touching it would unleash something none of them could control. His chest rose and fell too quickly, betraying the steady front he always tried to keep. Across the table, his wife leaned forward, subtle at first, her movements careful, almost rehearsed, but her eyes gave her away. They weren't calm. They were sharp, watchful, and filled with a kind of dread that made her seem smaller in her chair. She wanted to know what he saw, maybe because she already feared what it might be. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his voice faltering. "Shall I continue?" he asked, his tone quiet, almost cautious, but no one answered. Robert pressed the side button on his phone, shutting off the screen, and set it down face first on the table. "It's nothing," he said, his voice low, though the slight tremor betrayed him. Their son frowned, suspicion tightening in his chest. It didn't look like nothing. Robert's eyes snapped to him, sharp and sudden. "I said it was nothing." His words landed like a gavel, final and heavy, but not convincing. The boy leaned back, his jaw tight. He had seen his father angry before, but this wasn't anger, it was fear. That made it worse. His mother sat frozen, her hands clenched together in her lap. She lowered her gaze as if smoothing her skirt, but her knuckles were white, her shoulders stiff. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her silence said enough. The lawyer glanced from face to face, then down at the papers in front of him. He tried to continue, his voice steady once more, but the words about property and shares floated uselessly in the air. No one cared anymore. From the corner, Mrs. Harris, the housekeeper, shifted her weight. Her eyes stayed on the phone, lying silent but alive on the polished wood. She had worked in this house long enough to know that secrets had a way of slipping out, no matter how tightly people tried to hold them in. The son swallowed hard, glancing again at his father. The buzzing had stopped, but the silence it left behind felt even louder. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was hidden on that phone had less to do with money or land, and everything to do with him. And across the table, his mother's eyes flicked up just once, locking on his face before darting away again. It was only a second, but it was enough. She knew something, and he knew it too. The lawyer's words droned on, talking about assets and legal terms, but no one at the table was really listening. The air felt heavy, charged with something far bigger than money. All eyes kept drifting back to the phone lying face down on the polished wood, as if it were a loaded gun no one wanted to touch. The son couldn't take his eyes off it. He had grown up believing this house was his foundation, that his family name was his anchor. But now, with just one message, it felt as though the ground beneath him was cracking. He looked at his father. Robert sat rigid in his chair, jaw tight, his hand hovering just inches from the phone, as if afraid someone might snatch it away. His mother sat across from him, her face pale, her fingers twisting the edge of her skirt. She still hadn't spoken a word since Robert had declared, "It's nothing." The boy's stomach twisted. He thought back to a memory he had buried years ago. Back when he was a kid riding his bike past the corner store. Two old women were standing by the door, their voices sharp in the summer air. He had only caught a fragment, but it had stung. That boy doesn't look a thing like Robert. At the time he had brushed it off as gossip. People in small towns always talked. But now, sitting here, watching his parents' faces and the way silence clung to them like a shadow, the memory didn't feel like gossip anymore. It felt like a warning. He leaned forward, his elbows pressing into the table. His voice was low but steady. "This isn't nothing. Whatever's on that phone, it's about me, isn't it?" Robert's eyes flicked up sharply. "I told you to leave it." His tone was stern, but his voice cracked at the edges. The son held his father's gaze, his chest tightening. "I deserve to know." The lawyer shifted in his seat, clearing his throat nervously. Even he could feel it. This wasn't just a family spat. This was the unravelling of something that had been held together by threads for far too long. From the corner, Mrs. Harris's fingers brushed the apron pocket where a sealed envelope rested. Heavier now than it had ever been, she knew its time was coming. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then the phone buzzed again. Everyone jumped at the sound. Robert slammed his hand over it, gripping it so tightly his knuckles went white. The son's heart sank. He didn't need to see the screen to know. Whatever truth they were hiding, it was about him, and this time he wasn't going to let it go. The second buzz hadn't stopped echoing in the son's chest. He leaned back in his chair, his fists tightening, while Robert kept his hand clamped firmly over the phone. The lawyer sat frozen, his eyes darting nervously from one face to another. Then it happened. The mask that had held for years began to slip. His mother shifted in her seat, her back straight as always, her posture flawless, but her hands betrayed her. She clasped them so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned pale. Her heel tapped against the hardwood floor, sharp and uneven, no longer in her control. "Can we just get back to the will?" she blurted suddenly, her voice louder than she meant. It cut through the silence like glass shattering. The lawyer blinked, startled. Robert turned his head sharply toward her, but the son kept his eyes fixed on her. "Why do you want to rush this?" His tone wasn't angry yet. It was steady, too steady. She swallowed hard. "Because this isn't the time or the place." Her voice cracked, just a little. "That's not an answer," he said quietly. Her eyes flicked to the phone, then back to her son. In that split second, he saw something he had never noticed before. Not the polished, graceful woman he had always known, but someone cornered, afraid. His chest tightened. "You know what's on that phone, don't you?" Her lips parted, then closed again. She looked at Robert for rescue, but he stayed silent, his jaw set, his hand still covering the device. "Mum," the son pressed, his voice trembling now, though not from fear. "Tell me." Her eyes welled with tears, mascara clinging to her lashes. She shook her head quickly, almost desperately. "No, please, not here." The son leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "If you won't tell me." He glanced at the phone, then back at her. "I'll find out myself." The room froze again. Robert's grip tightened on the phone. His wife's shoulders sagged as though the weight she had carried for years was finally crushing her. And in the corner, Mrs. Harris pressed her hand to the envelope in her apron pocket, her pulse quickening. She knew the moment was coming sooner than she wanted. The son's words lingered in the air, sharp as broken glass, and his mother's eyes filled with terror. The air in the room had grown heavy, as though every breath carried the weight of secrets. The son leaned forward, his palms flat against the polished table. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned. "You've both been lying to me," he said, staring first at his father, then at his mother. "I don't know what's on that phone, but I know it's about me, and I'm done being treated like I can't handle the truth." Robert's jaw tightened. For most of his life, he had carried himself with restraint, a man who measured his words carefully, who never raised his voice unless he had to. But now, that restraint cracked. His fist slammed against the table, the sound echoing through the room. "That's enough!" The son flinched but didn't back down. "No, it's not enough. Not anymore." His voice rose, breaking with hurt. "Do you have any idea what it's like growing up hearing whispers, people saying I don't look like you? I told myself it was gossip. I told myself I belonged, but sitting here now, watching you both..." He shook his head, his voice trembling. "I know they were right." His mother reached across the table, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't say that. You're my son. Nothing changes that." He pulled his arm away, his body shaking. "Then tell me the truth, right now." Robert's face hardened, his lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes cold. "This is not the time, not the place." The boy cut him off, his voice sharp and filled with anguish. "When is the time? After I waste my whole life believing a lie?" Silence dropped over the room. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, his papers forgotten. And in the corner, Mrs. Harris felt her heart pound against her chest. Her hand slipped into her apron pocket, brushing against the envelope the old man had given her before the hospital. His words echoed in her memory. "When the time comes, you'll know." Her fingers tightened around the paper. Looking at the family now, the father's fury, the mother's guilt, the son's broken voice, she knew that moment was coming. The son's eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. "I deserve the truth," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The phone buzzed again under Robert's hand, and this time, no one could look away. The room was frozen in place. Robert's hand still pinned the buzzing phone to the table, his knuckles white. His wife sat trembling, tears spilling as she tried to catch her son's eyes. And the son, red-faced and shaking, could barely hold himself together. In the corner, Mrs. Harris could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. She had served this family for more than 2 decades. She had watched the boy grow from a toddler, racing down the halls to the young man now standing before his father, broken and furious. She had promised the old man she would protect his secret until the right time, and now she knew the time had come. Slowly she reached into the deep pocket of her apron. Her fingers brushed the edges of the worn envelope, the handwriting on the front still etched in her memory. She remembered the night he had given it to her, his voice weak but firm. "You'll know when it's needed. Don't let it die with me." She stepped forward. The sound of her shoes against the hardwood floor made everyone's heads snap toward her. The lawyer frowned, startled. Robert's eyes widened. His wife froze, her breath catching in her throat. Mrs. Harris placed the envelope carefully on the table, sliding it between the untouched glass of water and the lawyer's stack of papers. "What is this?" Robert demanded, his voice low and rough. Her own voice trembled, but she forced it out. "It's from your father. He gave it to me before the hospital. He told me to hold it until the day this family could no longer live under silence." For a moment no one breathed. Robert's wife covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with terror. The lawyer leaned forward, recognizing the familiar handwriting, and the son, he stared at the envelope as though it were a live wire, humming with power. Robert shook his head slowly, his voice breaking. "You had no right." But the words fell flat because everyone in that room knew it wasn't about rights. It was about truth. The son reached out. His hand hovered over the envelope, his fingers trembling as though the paper might burn him. When he finally touched it, the room seemed to tilt. And as he began to tear open the flap, every eye in the room followed, bracing for the words of a man who could still change their lives from beyond the grave. The son's hands shook as he slid the letter from its envelope. The paper was thin, its edges yellowed, but the handwriting was strong, deliberate. He unfolded it carefully, his breath unsteady. Everyone leaned closer, even the lawyer, as though the old man's voice might rise from the page. The son swallowed hard and began to read aloud. To my family. If these words are being read, then I am gone. And with me went a truth I should have spoken long ago. Years ago, doubts weighed heavy on me. Doubts no father should have to carry. I asked for a test, and the test confirmed my fear. The boy I raised was not born of my blood. The son's voice caught. He lowered the paper for a moment, his chest tightening as the words sank into him like stones. His mother buried her face in her hands, sobs escaping through her fingers. Robert sat rigid, his eyes closed, his jaw clenched so tightly it trembled. The boy forced himself to keep going. But listen to me clearly. Blood is not what makes a son. Love is, and by love, he was mine in every way that mattered. I guided him, taught him, laughed with him, and scolded him as only a father can. I loved him without condition, and I always will, even beyond this life. The lawyer shifted in his seat, his eyes glassy. Even Mrs. Harris bowed her head, her lips pressed tight, as though hearing the old man's voice again. The son's hands shook harder, but he read the last lines, his voice breaking. If you are angry, let it be at me. I was weak. I thought silence was protection, but silence only grows heavier with time. If you must blame someone, blame me. But do not blame each other. Do not let this truth destroy you. Let it bind you, because in the end, only love, not blood, will keep this family whole. The paper slipped slightly in his trembling hands. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grab hold of, but impossible to ignore. The son lowered the letter slowly, his eyes red, his voice gone. He knew, all along, he whispered. Robert opened his eyes at last, his face pale. Yes, he admitted softly. His voice cracked, the sound of a man finally too tired to hold up the walls he'd built. The son's head turned sharply toward him, his stare burning. And you said nothing? Robert's silence was louder than any confession. His mother sobbed harder, her shoulders shaking. And in that moment, the son's anger, grief, and confusion all collided into one searing truth. He wasn't just betrayed by the dead, he had been betrayed by the living. The letter still trembled in the son's hands, its words echoing louder than any voice in the room. His chest heaved as he stared at his father, waiting for an explanation that never came. Robert's silence was its own verdict. Then from across the table came the sound of his mother breaking. It wasn't words at first. It was a sob, raw and unguarded, the kind that slips out when years of control finally collapse. She pressed her hands over her mouth, but her whole body shook. Her shoulders hunched, her breath came in gasps, and the polished image she had carried for decades fell apart in seconds. "Mom," the son whispered, his voice trembling with both fear and fury, "tell me the truth." Her eyes, red and swollen, lifted to meet his. There was no mask left, no poise, no shield, just guilt, heavy and relentless. "I never meant for it to happen," she said, her voice thin, barely holding together. "It was years ago when your father and I when we were falling apart. I made a mistake, one night that I've regretted every single day since." Robert's head turned sharply toward her, his face ashen. "Don't," he warned, though the crack in his voice betrayed him. But she couldn't stop, not anymore. The secret had been carried too long. "I prayed no one would ever know," she continued, her words tumbling out between sobs. "But then you were born, and I saw it in your face every day, the difference. Your grandfather saw it too. I begged him not to tell. I thought if we all stayed quiet, if we just kept moving forward, maybe love would be enough." The son's breath caught. His stomach twisted as though the floor had dropped out from under him. "So it's true," he said, his voice breaking. "Everything people whispered, it was true." Tears spilled down her cheeks. She reached across the table, her hands shaking. "You are my son, no matter what. Nothing changes that." But he pulled back, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face flushed with pain, his fists clenched. You lied to me my whole life, both of you." His voice cracked under the weight of it. "And now you expect me to just accept it?" His mother's hands dropped helplessly onto the table. "I only wanted to protect you." The son's eyes burned, his voice hoarse. "You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourselves." The room fell into silence, the kind that choked more than soothed. Robert sat rigid, unable to speak. His wife sobbed quietly, her body bent under the weight of shame. And the son, standing now, looked at both of them as though seeing strangers. In the corner, Mrs. Harris held her breath, her hand pressed to her apron as if bracing herself for what came next. And the son, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade, said the words no one wanted to hear. "So who is my real father?" The son's words hit the room like a hammer. "So who is my real father?" Silence followed, the kind so heavy it pressed into the walls. His mother buried her face in her hands, sobs shaking her shoulders. Robert stared at her, his expression a storm of anger and heartbreak, the truth carved into the lines of his face. Finally, he pushed back his chair with a scrape that made everyone flinch. His voice erupted, raw and loud. "Do you think I didn't know?" He pointed a trembling hand at his wife. "I carried this shame every day. I heard the whispers, I saw the stares, and I still raised him as my son. I still gave him my name." His wife looked up, her face streaked with tears. "And I begged you not to tell him. I begged you to let him grow up without this burden." The son's voice cracked as he shouted back, "Without the burden? You call it that? You call the truth a burden?" His chest heaved, his fists balled so tightly his knuckles blanched. "You didn't protect me. You lied to me, both of you." Robert's voice broke, softer now but still fierce. "I loved you. That's why I stayed silent." The son shook his head, his throat tight. "No, you stayed silent because you were afraid." The lawyer shifted in his chair, his papers forgotten. He looked like he wanted to leave, to escape a storm he had no part in. And in the corner, Mrs. Harris could no longer stay silent. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "He told me," she said, her words cutting through the shouting. Everyone turned to her. "Before he died, your grandfather told me why he wrote that letter. He said the truth was heavy, but hiding it was heavier. He wanted this family to survive it, not be destroyed by it." The son turned towards her, his eyes wet and furious. "Survive? Look at us! We're tearing each other apart." Mrs. Harris swallowed, her voice firmer now. "That's why he left it in writing. He knew the day would come when silence was no longer love, only poison." The words hung in the air, raw and undeniable. The son wiped at his face, but the tears kept coming. His voice dropped to a whisper. "So what am I supposed to do with this, with all of you?" No one had an answer. His mother wept quietly, Robert sat hollow-eyed, and the lawyer avoided their gaze. The truth had cracked open the foundation of their lives, and nothing would put it back together. The son looked down at the letter in his hands, the final words of a man who had loved him despite everything. His grip tightened on the paper, and in that moment he realized whatever choice he made next would decide the fate of them all. The son stood at the head of the table, the letter clutched tightly in his hand. His chest rose and fell, his eyes burning from tears he refused to wipe away. His parents sat across from him, broken in different ways. His mother collapsed in sobs, his father rigid and hollow, his silence saying more than words ever could. He took a long breath, steadying himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but every syllable carried the weight of years. "All my life I thought this family was built on truth, and now I see it was built on silence." He looked down at the letter, his grandfather's words echoing in his head. "Love, not blood." He slipped the folded paper into his jacket pocket. "This," he said softly, "is all I need from this house. His words, his love, that's enough." Robert leaned forward, his voice breaking. "What about the inheritance? He wanted it for you." The son shook his head. "I don't want the money. I don't want the land. Let it tear you apart if it has to. I won't let it tear me apart too." His mother reached for him, her fingers trembling. "Please, don't walk away from us." He looked at her, his voice gentler now, though no less firm. "You walked away from me the moment you chose lies over honesty. You didn't think I was strong enough to handle the truth, but I was. I always was." The lawyer sat motionless, the pages of the will still resting on his lap, forgotten. The son turned toward the door. For a moment, the weight of the house seemed to cling to him, pulling at his shoulders, whispering for him to stay. But he straightened, pushed the chair aside and walked away. Mrs. Harris stepped forward just as he passed. Her hand brushed his arm lightly, a simple touch, filled with quiet pride and sorrow. She had watched him grow, watched him fight, and now watched him choose his own path. He gave her a small nod, unable to find words, and stepped outside. The heavy doors closed behind him. The arguments inside would continue, voices breaking against each other like waves on rocks. But out here, on the porch beneath the fading light, the world felt wider. The autumn air was crisp, the sky stretched open above him, and for the first time all day he felt steady. Hurt, but steady. He slipped his hand into his pocket, pressing the letter close to his heart. The man who raised him was gone, but his words would carry him forward. In the end, this story reminds us that family is not always defined by blood. It is defined by truth, by trust, and by the love we choose to give each other. Silence can feel like protection, but in time, silence becomes its own kind of betrayal. The real strength is not in hiding the truth, but in facing it, even when it hurts. So here is the question. If you were in his place, would you choose to carry a painful truth that breaks your heart, or would you rather live with a comforting lie that keeps the peace? Thank you for watching, and we'll meet again on Rain Inside.